The fog of history is a thick and treacherous thing. It clings to the colossal figures, illuminating them in harsh, permanent light, while allowing smaller, yet no less brilliant, stars to fade into the surrounding gloom. We all know Nelson. We know Trafalgar. But if we are seeking the foundational spirit of the Royal Navy, the reckless, self-made courage forged not in aristocracy, but in sheer, audacious merit, we must turn our gaze away from the monumental column and toward a forgotten name, Edward Pellew. His defining moment, the one that should have cemented his status as a permanent fixture in the pantheon of naval gods, occurred not in a massive fleet action, but in a desperate, single-ship duel in the early years of the war against revolutionary France. The year was 1793. The stakes were nothing less than the soul of the British fighting man. Picture the scene, the waters off the start point, the great headland of Devon, on a bright, tense day in June. The air was cold, the sea was choppy, and the threat of invasion was a suffocating reality. The French, emboldened by their revolution and brimming with ideological fervor, had poured their best resources into their marine national. They were ready to challenge Britain's ancient supremacy. Sailing in pursuit was HMS Nymph, a 36-gun frigate captained by Edward Pellew. And we must be perfectly clear, the odds were stacked against him. Nymph had been captured from the French just 2 years prior. Though a fast ship, her crew was a rough assembly, men cobbled together through the brutal necessities of the press gang, largely untrained in the exacting choreography of naval combat. They were still learning to live and die together. Her opponent was the French frigate Cleopatra, commanded by Jean Moulin. The Cleopatra was a sleek, professional machine, recently refitted and sailing with a seasoned, disciplined crew. Moulin was a man of skill and reputation, confident in his ship's superior manpower and his nation's newly acquired martial zeal. He fully expected to make short work of the English vessel. Pellew, however, was not concerned with expectations. He was concerned only with closing the distance. His doctrine was terrifyingly simple and brutally effective: immediate, overwhelming violence. He refused the conventional dance of maneuver. His command rang out across the deck, urging his men to hold their fire, to save their mettle until the absolute last possible moment. The men of Nymph, pressed and terrified, saw their captain standing exposed on the quarterdeck, a beacon of sheer, aggressive nerve, and found their courage in his defiance. As the two frigates converged, the silence was agonizing, broken only by the crash of waves and the creak of the straining timbers. Moulin, adhering to the standard naval protocol of firing the first broadside at long range, unleashed his opening salvo. It ripped through the rigging of the Nymph, tearing sails and sending splinters flying, a prelude to the slaughter Moulin anticipated. But Pellew held fast. He continued to bear down, ignoring the damage, pushing his ship closer and closer until the vessels were almost within spitting distance, close enough that the faces of the enemy gunners could be clearly seen. It was a suicidal position, a moment of extraordinary risk that defied every established convention of naval warfare. It was in this instant, when the ships were locked in a proximity that made escape impossible, that Pellew gave the order that would decide the engagement. The resulting British broadside was a concentrated detonation of iron and fire. Fired at point-blank range, it tore through the Cleopatra's hull and deck, causing devastation that no preliminary skirmish could ever match. The sheer force of the metal shattered the French gun stations and turned the deck into a scene of carnage. The French crew, accustomed to the elegant, long-range duel, were physically and psychologically overwhelmed by the intensity of Pellew's sudden, close-quarters attack. The duel dissolved instantly from a grand naval maneuver into a savage, close-quarters slugging match. The Nymph continued to maintain a searing, disciplined rate of fire, her guns operating with a speed born of Pellew's ruthless training. The French fought back, but their initial shock cost them the momentum. Their captain, Moulin, fought desperately to rally his men, but his efforts were soon silenced. He fell, mortally wounded, leaving his ship leaderless amidst the smoke and the wreckage. The climax arrived with a shocking, final maneuver. Recognizing the enemy's broken command and the havoc his gunnery had wrought, Pellew shouted the order to grapple. He lashed his ship to the Cleopatra and ordered his men to board. The British, surging across the short gap with cutlasses and pistols, were met with only disorganized resistance. The French will to fight had been utterly extinguished in the face of the British audacity and discipline. In less than an hour, the Cleopatra struck her colors. The battle that should have been a rout for the French, a predictable victory over an undertrained, refitted enemy, was instead a stunning, violent reversal. It was a victory won not just by gunpowder, but by a captain's refusal to accept impossible odds. It was the moment the world should have learned the name Edward Pellew, for it was in that single, decisive hour that he demonstrated the tactical genius and personal heroism that would, in the shadowed years to come, keep the vast British Empire afloat. The close-range brutality that decided the fate of the Cleopatra was merely a single, sharp action in a war that was consuming the globe. To truly understand the strategic importance of Edward Pellew's genius, we must pull back and examine the impossible backdrop against which he fought. For Britain, the years following the French Revolution were not merely a period of conflict. They were an existential crisis, a great contest for global supremacy that threatened to end centuries of hard-won influence. The spark was, of course, the French Revolution itself. When the Bourbon monarchy fell and the Republic rose, it didn't just change the map of France, it unleashed an ideology that terrified the crowned heads of Europe. This was not a typical dynastic dispute over a few acres of territory, this was a war of systems, of ideals. The Revolution, exporting its radical, destabilizing principles, declared war on the ancient order. Britain, the very embodiment of that order and the dominant naval power, was the ultimate target. The conflict, known as the War of the First Coalition, began in 1793, but its roots ran deeper than the execution of a king. It was a collision of two geopolitical titans over control of the world's oceans, trade routes, and colonies. For Britain, the navy was her lifeblood, her shield, and her sword. If the French could achieve supremacy at sea, the consequences were immediate and apocalyptic. The invasion of the British Isles, the seizure of rich colonies in the West and East Indies, and the complete strangulation of the island nations' commerce. The problem, from the Admiralty's perspective, was utterly and terrifyingly impossible. Why impossible? Because revolutionary France commanded resources unlike any previous European aggressor. The concept of levée en masse, mass conscription, meant France could raise armies of a size never before seen. While Britain's strength lay primarily in its relatively small, professional Royal Navy, France's combined naval and land forces represented a hydra-headed threat. The French fleet was substantial, well captained by experienced officers from the old regime who had pledged allegiance to the Republic, and it was powered by a nationalistic fervor that often bordered on fanaticism. The sheer scale of the logistical problem facing London was paralyzing. The Royal Navy had to simultaneously blockade major French ports, Brest, Toulon, protect convoys in the Atlantic from privateers, secure the West Indies, where sugar was the economic engine of the era, and maintain a vigilant presence in the East, safeguarding the nascent, invaluable interests in India. This vast operational remit stretched British resources to the breaking point. The Admiralty was constantly forced to choose which vital interest to defend, knowing that the others were left dangerously exposed. Every single frigate, every single experienced captain, was an irreplaceable commodity in this brutal numbers game. Furthermore, the naval war was not going smoothly for Britain in the early stages. Despite a few tactical victories, the political landscape was shifting constantly, forcing Britain to commit troops and ships to support shifting alliances with Austria, Spain, and other continental powers, all of whom proved unreliable. The early British naval strategy was often overly cautious, relying on slow, methodical maneuvers and blockades. This hesitancy stemmed from the fear of losing capital ships. The loss of a 74-gun vessel could not be easily replaced, but the Republic could churn out manpower. The inherent political instability within Britain also compounded the crisis. The same revolutionary zeal that powered the French armies also found echoes in British society, leading to domestic unrest and, critically, the Spithead and Nore mutinies of 1797. These were massive, organized insurrections by thousands of disgruntled British sailors protesting abysmal pay and horrific conditions. These mutinies, occurring in the very heart of the fleet, temporarily paralyzed the Royal Navy at the height of the war. They presented the terrifying prospect of the entire naval shield collapsing from within, leaving Britain naked before the French threat. It was into this volatile, high-stakes, and nearly impossible theatre of war that Edward Pellew emerged. The Navy was demoralized, the logistical demands were crushing, and the national morale was fragile. Victory could no longer be won by relying solely on the old guard or the old methods. What was desperately needed were commanders who were not only brilliant tacticians but who possessed the moral authority and personal courage to restore confidence, men who could turn a broken, pressed crew into a disciplined, unstoppable fighting unit through sheer force of will. The fight against the Cleopatra was more than a capture, it was a potent psychological victory. It was a flash of aggressive brilliance that cut through the widespread fear and uncertainty, demonstrating that British bravery, when coupled with an unorthodox, audacious fighting spirit, could still shatter the confidence of the seemingly unstoppable French machine. Pellew was, in essence, the right man with the right temperament at the exact moment Britain needed a defiant new hero to stem the rising revolutionary tide. The nation, facing impossible odds, had found its forgotten champion. In the rigid, highly stratified world of the 18th century Royal Navy, an officer's commission was often less a badge of skill and more a certificate of lineage. The great ships of the line were typically commanded by sons of dukes, landed gentry, or influential political figures. Access to promotion, advantageous postings, and the patronage necessary to build a brilliant career was almost entirely closed off to those without the right family name or the right connections at the Admiralty. Edward Pellew, however, was a profound and unsettling exception to this rule. He was born not to landed wealth, but to a comparatively humble Cornish family in 1757. His father, Samuel Pellew, was a commander in the packet service, a respectable but far from aristocratic profession. The family had limited means, and any expectation of a comfortable, preordained career path was shattered by an early tragedy. Pellew lost both his parents when he was still a child. This sudden void forced him and his siblings into a difficult reality. The safety net of inherited wealth and influence simply did not exist. For young Edward, a future was not something to be bequeathed, it was something to be seized. And the only place a high-spirited, aggressive, and fiercely intelligent boy could seize a career using only his wits and muscle was the sea. At the age of 13, he shipped out as a midshipman aboard the 32-gun frigate HMS Juno. His entry into the service was not marked by smooth introductions to powerful godfathers, but by a rough-and-tumble induction into a life of brutal hardship. He was an officer cadet, yes, but he was dependent entirely on his own ability to endure, learn, and impress. He quickly gained a reputation for two distinct, and often conflicting, traits: an astonishing dexterity and physical courage, and an abrasive, headstrong temperament. This lack of aristocratic polish made him a problematic figure in the wardroom. He was often quarrelsome, quick to temper, and possessed of a defiant streak that frequently put him at odds with superior officers who valued deference above dynamic action. He was transferred between several ships in quick succession, a sign that while his ability was undeniable, his personality was often intolerable to the established naval order. Crucially, his subsequent rise was a testament to the fact that, even in an age of entrenched privilege, the Royal Navy occasionally had to bow to sheer, undeniable merit. Pellew's only currency was his relentless drive and his readiness to engage in battles that others deemed too risky. He lacked the influence to secure a comfortable, safe commission on a guard ship. Therefore, he had to make his name in the crucible of war, where bravery and skill were the only things that mattered between life and death. This unconventional lineage was his greatest strength. Unlike the officers who expected promotion as their birthright, Pellew understood that every command, every victory, had to be earned through personal exposure and relentless dedication to the art of war. This self-made man, unburdened by the conventions of his class, was free to embrace the very aggressive, unconventional, and often dangerous tactics that the situation demanded. He would not be constrained by doctrine, he would be constrained only by what the impossible odds required him to do. The foundation of his future fame was laid here, a man whose authority was derived not from a signature on a peerage, but from his demonstrated, fearless competence under fire. Pellew's nascent, turbulent career was soon thrown into the white-hot crucible of the American War of Independence. This conflict, beginning in 1775, provided the ultimate training ground for a young officer eager to prove his worth, and it was here that Edward Pellew first demonstrated the tactical aggression and personal fearlessness that would later define his legend. His defining early service came during the pivotal campaign on Lake Champlain in 1776. This was not the grand, deep-sea sailing that defined the Royal Navy. It was a desperate, gritty fight for control of the essential waterways separating Canada from the rebelling colonies. It was a war of small, hastily constructed vessels, where naval action resembled riverine combat more than oceanic battle. Pellew was serving as a master's mate aboard the small schooner HMS Carleton. The British fleet, under the command of General Guy Carleton, faced a makeshift but determined American force led by the formidable Benedict Arnold. The American objective was simple: halt the British advance south from Canada. The crucial engagements were the Battle of Valka Island in October 1776. It was during this battle that Pellew's unconventional bravery first caught the eye of his superiors. When the Carleton's commanding officer, Lieutenant John Dacres, was severely wounded, the command devolved to the young Pellew. He was not a captain, not even officially a lieutenant at the time, but he seized control of the vessel without hesitation. The Carleton was trapped in a treacherous situation, running aground and exposed to punishing fire from the American gunboats. Instead of panicking or surrendering, Pellew took the initiative. He personally directed the efforts to free the ship, all while exposed to musket and cannon fire. Aboard a small schooner, every man was visible, and every action was critical. It was here, under extreme duress, that he displayed his natural command, maintaining the discipline of his crew, keeping the guns firing, and ultimately saving the vessel. The British won the battle, crushing Arnold's fleet and securing Lake Champlain for the time being. But for Pellew, the real victory was personal. His actions were immediately noted and reported. This was not a favor sought through a dinner with a lord, but a direct recognition of battlefield performance. He was immediately promoted to lieutenant for his conspicuous bravery, a direct, merit-based advancement earned under enemy fire. This was the first, significant validation that the man without privilege could indeed rise through the ranks. His service continued throughout the American War, including time aboard the frigate Blonde, where he was part of the capture of several American privateers. In one famous anecdote aboard the Blonde, he reportedly impressed his captain so much by his fearlessness during a gale that he was given the command of a small prize, the brig Apollo, a further testament to his growing reputation for competence and aggressive seamanship. Yet, despite his promotions and his service, the war ended in a humiliating defeat for the crown. When the great naval contest ceased, Pellew found himself, like many capable officers, placed on half-pay. The period of peace from 1783 to 1793 was a lean time for the young officer. He was forced to spend several years on the sidelines, commanding small packet ships in the interim. This frustrating pause, however, only sharpened his appetite for action. He had tasted combat, earned his rank with blood and sweat, and knew the only way back to glory and full employment was through another war. The American crucible had not only taught him how to fight, it taught him that only conspicuous, successful action could overcome the overwhelming inertia of the naval establishment. He was ready when the French Revolution finally gave him the theater he deserved. Edward Pellew's fame would ultimately be built on naval victories and tactical brilliance, but the incident that secured his heroic reputation, demonstrating his sheer, selfless humanity and physical bravery to the entire nation, occurred not in battle, but in a horrific peacetime tragedy. This act of pure courage stands as a monumental pillar in his biography, illustrating that his leadership was rooted not just in command discipline, but in a profound moral authority. The date was January 26, 1796. Pellew was serving as captain of the 44-gun frigate HMS Indefatigable, anchored off Plymouth Sound. A brutal gale, one of the fiercest in living memory, was raging. The wind howled from the southeast, driving mountainous waves toward the treacherous, rocky coastline. It was a day when all sensible mariners sought the deepest protection of the harbor, yielding completely to the violence of nature. Out in the raging Sound, disaster was unfolding. The East Indiaman Dutton, a large, civilian troopship carrying over 500 soldiers, women, and children bound for the West Indies, had been caught in the gale. Her anchors failed, and she was driven inexorably onto the rocks beneath the citadel, where she was immediately battered by the crushing surf. The situation was instantly desperate. The Dutton lay on her beam ends, her masts breaking, her hull groaning under the repeated hammer blows of the sea. Confusion and terror gripped the hundreds aboard. The soldiers, trained for land warfare, were paralyzed by the raw, unstoppable force of the ocean. Local rescue attempts were quickly abandoned. The shore was lined with helpless spectators, including many naval officers, who recognized the risk as too great. To approach the wreck was not just dangerous, it was considered an act of suicide. Pellew, observing the carnage from the comparative safety of his own ship, was seized by an overwhelming determination. He saw not a logistical problem, but a moral imperative. He immediately ordered his barge to be launched, a command met with protests from his own men who knew the boat would likely be smashed instantly. Ignoring all protests, Pellew seized control, declaring that if his crew would not accompany him, he would go alone. This declaration was the ultimate act of leadership. It shamed and inspired his men, who swiftly manned the oars. Reaching the wreck was perilous enough, but what Pellew did next was legendary. The seas were so violent that a close approach was impossible. Knowing the Dutton was breaking apart, he ordered his boat alongside the shattered hull, and in an act that defined his life, Edward Pellew himself scaled the wreck. He found a scene of utter chaos, drunken soldiers, panicked women, and officers who had lost control. Pellew, now standing on the deck of a doomed ship with the entire coast watching, took immediate, decisive command. He was not their captain, yet his sheer presence, his resolute calm amidst the tempest, instantly restored order. He drew his sword and announced, with full authority, that he would run through the first man to disobey his orders. He established rigging and lines to the shore, personally supervising the passage of the terrified passengers. He worked relentlessly for hours, organizing the evacuation of the non-combatants first, then the remaining soldiers. He was the last man to leave the wreck, stepping onto the shore only seconds before the battered hull of the Dutton finally gave way and disintegrated into the surf. Pellew had, by sheer will and courage, personally overseen the rescue of almost every soul, hundreds of lives, from a situation universally deemed hopeless. This was not a tactical victory, it was a moral one. It earned him the freedom of the city of Plymouth and, critically, a baronetcy from the king. From this moment on, he was not just a successful captain, he was Sir Edward Pellew, a celebrated national hero. His crew knew, and the nation knew, that this was a man whose bravery was absolute, forging a moral bond of trust that no defeat could ever shatter. The spectacular, personal heroism of Sir Edward Pellew often obscures the dire context in which he operated. The early years of the war against revolutionary France were not a string of glorious Trafalgar-esque victories for the Royal Navy. They were, in fact, scarred by humiliation, indecision, and profound strategic failures. This demoralizing backdrop is essential to understanding why the aggressive, unconventional tactics of Pellew were so desperately needed and why they were, initially, considered so radical. The most crippling strategic failure was the near-total loss of control over the fleet's morale, which culminated in the Great Mutinies of 1797. Just a year after Pellew's heroic rescue of the Dutton, the bulk of the British naval shield threatened to collapse. The mutiny at Spithead and the more dangerous mutiny at the Nore saw thousands of sailors, driven to despair by abysmal pay, brutal discipline, and horrific rations, seize control of their ships. These were not isolated acts of defiance. They were organized, sophisticated insurrections that temporarily paralyzed the ability of Britain to project power or even defend its own coastline. At one point, the rebellious fleet at the Nore blocked the mouth of the Thames, cutting off London's vital commercial lifeline. The message sent to France was clear and devastating. Britain's naval dominance was not a given, but a fragile construct rotting from within. Beyond the internal turmoil, the strategic reality of the early coalition wars was grim. While Britain excelled in individual ship-to-ship actions, large-scale fleet actions often devolved into costly, indecisive stalemates. The logistical burdens of blockading the massive French ports, Brest, Toulon, and Rochefort, were immense, leading to exhausted crews and ships suffering from continuous wear and tear. Compounding this was the inherent caution of many senior British commanders. They were the product of an older, formalized doctrine that prioritized the preservation of the line of battle above aggressive maneuvering. The loss of a single capital ship was viewed as a career-ending disaster. This culture bred a certain degree of operational timidity, allowing the French fleet, energized by revolutionary ideology, to often escape or engage on terms favorable to themselves. The failures in the Mediterranean, the costly withdrawals from various continental ventures, and the relentless pressure of French privateers on merchant shipping painted a picture not of invincible supremacy, but of a power struggling to hold the line. The Royal Navy was not achieving the strategic, morale-boosting victories that the nation craved. It was into this atmosphere of strategic fatigue and internal crisis that Edward Pellew's record truly shone. His victories, the Nymph over the Cleopatra, and his other single-ship captures, were not just individual triumphs, they were vital infusions of confidence into a demoralized service. They demonstrated that audacity, speed, and superior gunnery could decisively overcome numerical parity and even superior French ship design. Pellew's innovative, aggressive spirit became the desperate counter-narrative to the prevailing gloom. His tactics were considered suicidal by the old guard because they flew in the face of conventional wisdom. Yet, they offered the only viable path forward, a doctrine that could win spectacular, morale-shattering victories against the enemy, thereby restoring the internal discipline and esprit de corps that had been so severely eroded by defeat and neglect. The humiliating defeats had cleared the slate for the arrival of the genius who dared to defy the rules. Edward Pellew's true tactical genius was most sharply honed and brilliantly displayed aboard the frigate. These ships, nimble, fast, and relatively inexpensive compared to the great ships of the line, were generally relegated to scouting, escort, and reconnaissance. Under Pellew, however, the frigate was transformed from a naval utility vessel into a potent instrument of aggressive, decisive warfare. He became the undisputed frigate maestro, rewriting the operational manual for these cruises. Pellew understood that the frigate's speed and shallow draft were not merely defensive advantages, they were offensive weapons. His strategic insight was simple: use the frigate's velocity to force the action on his own terms. While capital ships were bound by the formalities of the battle line, a frigate under Pellew's command could engage, disengage, and maneuver with a terrifying unpredictability that unnerved his opponents. The core of his innovation lay in the relentless training he imposed upon his crews, a standard he upheld across all his ships, from the Nymph to the Indefatigable. Unlike many captains who were content with minimal operational proficiency, Pellew drove his men to achieve a level of physical and mechanical synchronization that bordered on fanaticism. He focused heavily on two critical areas: speed in sail handling. A moment's delay in changing sail could mean the loss of the weather gauge or the failure to close a pursuit. Pellew's crews practiced sail changes, reefing, and tacking until they were performed with machine-like precision, often under simulated battle conditions. This superior handling meant his ships could consistently outmaneuver the enemy, gaining a crucial advantage in positioning. Superior gunnery and rate of fire. Conventional naval doctrine favored slow, carefully aimed fire. Pellew demanded speed. His crews were drilled incessantly in the efficient loading and firing of their guns, pushing their rate of fire far beyond the standard. He employed a technique of holding fire until the ships were within point-blank range, and then unleashing a rapid, overwhelming sequence of broadsides. This was his suicidal doctrine, a high-risk gamble that relied on shock and concentrated violence to shatter the enemy's will to fight before they could effectively return fire. This doctrine created a crucial tactical paradox. The enemy, observing the fast-closing British frigate, assumed Pellew was being reckless or overconfident. Instead, his approach was a carefully calculated application of overwhelming force at the moment of highest impact. The first, Devastating broadside fired at extreme close quarters had a demoralizing and physically destructive effect far exceeding that of a long-range exchange, effectively ending many duels before they truly began. Furthermore, Pellew used his frigate squadrons to actively hunt French privateers and cruisers, operating with an uncompromising aggression that essentially cleared the western approaches of enemy threats. This was a direct, invaluable service to British commerce and security that often went unnoticed in the grand narratives of fleet actions, yet it was absolutely vital to sustaining the war effort. In essence, Pellew transformed the frigate from a supporting player into a frontline weapon. His ships were faster, better drilled, and commanded by a leader willing to push them to the absolute limit of their capabilities. This innovative application of speed and violence was his signature contribution to naval tactics, laying the groundwork for the more aggressive and decisive approach that would eventually characterize the entire Royal Navy. He had turned the tool of reconnaissance into the instrument of doom. We return now to the defining moment of Edward Pellew's early career, the action that secured his fame and set the template for his audacious command style. The single-ship duel against the French frigate Cleopatra on June 18, 1793. This engagement was not a coincidence, it was a deliberate, relentless act of pursuit, a tactical decision by Pellew to force a fight that, by all conventional naval wisdom, he had little chance of winning. The stage was set off the English Channel, an area vital to British security. Pellew, commanding the newly refitted HMS Nymph, sighted the French 40-gun frigate sailing brazenly toward the Channel Islands. The French ship, commanded by Captain Jean Moulin, was sleek, heavily armed, and sailed by a crew brimming with the revolutionary spirit. Moulin was confident. His ship had a slight edge in both size and weight of broadside, and his men were veteran sailors. He felt no hesitation in engaging the British vessel. The opening move was Pellew's. He signaled the chase, turning the Nymph into the wind and relentlessly bearing down on his quarry. This was not the expected action. In the age of sail, captains were often hesitant to enter a straight-line pursuit against a ship of equal or superior force. Such chases allowed the enemy to pick the moment of engagement or, worse, to lure the pursuer into a dangerous tactical disadvantage. Pellew, however, knew his ship and, crucially, he knew his crew. His men, pressed into service and trained with a punishing intensity, were faster than any French crew at handling the sails. He used this superior seamanship to his advantage, driving the Nymph harder and faster than Moulin expected. The chase was not merely about closing the distance, it was a psychological operation. Pellew wanted to convey a message: we are coming, and we will not break off. Moulin, initially confident, began to find the relentless pace unsettling. He attempted evasive maneuvers, but Pellew counteracted each one with flawless precision. The British ship seemed glued to the Cleopatra's stern. Moulin had expected a cautious, long-range exchange of fire, a polite duel. Instead, he was being run down by a ship that seemed propelled by pure, aggressive fury. As the day wore on and the gap narrowed, the French frustration mounted. Captain Moulin reportedly consulted his officers, debating whether to flee toward the sanctuary of a French port or to turn and fight the persistent Englishmen. Moulin made the fateful decision to turn, believing his superior armament would quickly silence the Nymph and save him the embarrassment of a prolonged chase. Pellew saw the turn as his moment. He had forced the French captain's hand. He ordered the decks cleared for action, the tension aboard the Nymph becoming almost unbearable. The men braced themselves, knowing that Pellew's doctrine required them to hold their nerve until the very last moment. Every eye was fixed on the approaching French frigate. The distance closed to pistol-shot range. This was where the conventional rules of engagement dictated the French should have opened fire with their poursuivants, the forward-facing chase guns. Moulin held back slightly, perhaps planning to deliver a devastating full broadside once the ships were parallel. But Pellew gave him no time for finesse. Driven by the philosophy that a battle should be decided in the first 5 minutes, he deliberately closed the distance further, driving his ships so near that their yards almost interlocked. The two frigates were now rushing toward a terrifying, almost immediate collision. This was not courage, this was audacity bordering on madness. It was a move designed to destroy the enemy's tactical plan and substitute it with raw, devastating shock. The French confidence was about to meet the unwavering discipline of the British pressgang recruits, led by a man who refused to believe in impossible odds. The moment of truth had arrived, and it was defined by sheer, terrifying proximity. Pellew, having forced the engagement by driving the Nymph almost within touching distance of the Cleopatra, now demanded the impossible from his newly pressed crew. This was the hour where superior training and unbreakable discipline would have to overcome the French advantage in manpower and experience. As the two frigates surged forward, almost parallel, the silence broke with a deafening, concentrated roar. Pellew held his nerve until the very last possible second, and when the order was finally given, it was not for a single, hesitant broadside, but for a coordinated, continuous, and devastating sequence. The first cannonade from the Nymph, fired at point-blank range, struck the Cleopatra with the physical force of a hammer blow. The effects were instantaneous and catastrophic. Unlike the damage inflicted by long-range fire, which might shatter a spar or tear a sail, this concentrated blast was designed to kill and disable. Great holes were torn in the French hull, sending splinters the size of daggers flying across the decks. The French gun crews, caught by surprise by the overwhelming violence, found their stations decimated, their guns disabled, and their confidence evaporating. Pellew, a man of terrifying calm in a maelstrom, stood exposed on the quarterdeck, personally directing the Nymph's maneuvering. He ordered the helm to maintain the agonizingly close position, effectively nailing his ship to the side of the enemy. This forced the duel to be decided by gunnery speed and crew endurance, eliminating the French ability to use their superior sailing skills to gain distance or position. The combat devolved immediately into a ferocious, close-quarters slugging match. The British crew, who had practiced this precise moment for months under Pellew's merciless tutelage, performed with the mechanical precision of a well-oiled machine. They sponged, loaded, and ran out their guns with a speed that left the French reeling. The rate of fire from the Nymph was measurably superior, turning the battle into a one-sided slaughter on the French gun decks. Captain Moulin of the Cleopatra fought desperately to rally his men. He was a brave officer, yet the psychological shock of the British aggression was too much. The French were accustomed to a more gentlemanly, distance-keeping duel. They were unprepared for Pellew's doctrine of immediate, overwhelming violence. Moulin attempted to respond in kind, but his own broadsides, while heavy, lacked the concentrated impact of the British fire, which tore into the Cleopatra's rigging and sails, crippling her ability to maneuver. In the midst of the chaos, a pivotal moment occurred. A French broadside managed to cripple the Nymph's main topmast. The massive spar, now hanging dangerously, threatened to crash down onto the deck, potentially disabling the British ship or killing Pellew himself. Yet, in a testament to the discipline he instilled, the British crew reacted not with panic, but with immediate, practiced action, isolating the damage even as their cannons roared on. The ultimate moment of collapse for the French command came when Captain Moulin was struck down. A British musket ball found its mark, and the brave French commander fell, mortally wounded. In a final, desperate act of duty, he attempted to pass his commission, the symbol of his authority, to his second-in-command, but it was tragically snatched away by the wind, landing instead in the sea. The ship, already bleeding and shattered, was now leaderless. The Cleopatra staggered under the incessant fire, her wheel shot away, her decks slick with blood, and her command structure broken. The ship had been turned into a floating wreck by the sheer concentration of British fire. It was clear to Pellew that the psychological moment had arrived. The enemy's ability to resist was shattered, and their ship was crippled. The time for finesse was over. It was time for the final, physical assertion of dominance. With the Cleopatra crippled, her commander dead, and her decks in utter disarray from the concentrated fire, Edward Pellew recognized that the battle had entered its psychological final phase. The relentless bombardment had reduced the French ship from an organized fighting force to a collection of shocked, wounded men. Now was the time for the ultimate, crushing assertion of British dominance, the brutal intimacy of the boarding action. This was the moment that truly set Pellew's aggression apart. Most captains would have been content to stand off and continue the punishing cannonade, patiently awaiting the French surrender. But Pellew sought not merely victory, but annihilation of the enemy's will. He intended to drive home the point that the new British fighting doctrine was uncompromising. Surrender was the only acceptable conclusion to his pursuit. The order was shouted across the mangled deck of the Nymph, "Grapple and board." Seamen, already exhausted from the frantic pace of the gunnery, scrambled onto the shattered quarterdeck. The grappling hooks flew across the narrow gap between the frigates, catching in the remaining French rigging and railing. With a sharp, shuddering jerk, the two ships were lashed together, transforming the open sea into a temporary, blood-soaked arena. The moment the Nymph crew understood their objective, to physically seize the enemy ship, a renewed surge of adrenaline and fury took hold. They poured over the rails, cutlasses drawn and pistols blazing, led by the midshipmen and officers who had survived the battle thus far. They dropped onto the deck of the Cleopatra, landing amidst the pools of blood, the fallen timbers, and the bodies of the French gunners. The French resistance was disorganized and panicked. Mullen's death had left a vacuum of command, and the surviving officers were struggling to form a coherent defense. The hand-to-hand combat that ensued was desperate and bloody, but brief. The British boarding party, driven by the ferocious example of their captain and the sheer momentum of their successful broadside, fought with a disciplined savagery that overcame the exhausted French defense. The key psychological blow was struck when the British swept toward the forecastle. The sight of the English sailors, their faces blackened by powder and their cutlasses dripping, utterly destroyed whatever morale remained. This was a physical invasion, a final, unanswerable violation of their ship. The sheer audacity of the maneuver, to board a frigate of comparable size after a short, violent gun duel, was an unprecedented tactical shock. In less than 10 minutes after the grappling irons were secured, the remaining French officers understood the futility of resistance. Their brave captain was dead, their ship was a wreck, and the British were in possession of their deck. An officer signaled the end, and the French colors were finally struck. The Cleopatra, a symbol of French naval pride, was now a humiliated prize of war. The silence that followed the close-quarters melee was profound, broken only by the cries of the wounded and the sound of the ships rolling in the swell. The victory was total. Not only had Pellew captured a superior frigate, but he had done so with a crew of newly pressed men against a seasoned French force. The profound strategic significance of this action lay in the psychological message it sent across the entire channel. Pellew had proven that the revolutionary zeal of the French could not withstand the superior seamanship, devastating close-range gunnery, and the uncompromising audacity of a British captain who refused to acknowledge defeat. The capture of the Cleopatra was more than a single prize, it was a potent, desperately needed infusion of national confidence. It was the moment that the forgotten hero, Edward Pellew, stepped out of the shadow of privilege and announced the arrival of a new, aggressive, and merit-driven style of naval warfare, a style that would be necessary to save Britain from the impossible odds ahead. The spectacular capture of the Cleopatra was merely the beginning of Pellew's legacy as the frigate maestro. His reputation quickly preceded him, but a later action, involving the French Duguay-Trouin, cemented his standing as a commander whose sheer psychological presence was often enough to secure victory against seemingly superior forces. The context here shifted from the war against the French Republic to the struggle against its uneasy, wealthy ally, Spain. By 1805, Spain had entered the conflict on the side of Napoleon, and the immense flow of gold and silver from her South American colonies became a crucial source of war finance for the French Empire. Intercepting these treasure fleets was not just a naval matter, it was an act of economic warfare vital to British survival. Pellew, still commanding the powerful frigate HMS Indefatigable, a ship he had personally seen converted from a two-decker into a massive, heavily armed single-deck frigate, was tasked with patrolling the vital western approaches. His objective was to seek out and destroy or capture French and Spanish commerce raiders. In August 1805, Pellew sighted a formidable vessel. It was the French 74-gun ship of the line, the Duguay-Trouin, which had been part of a failed attempt to escape the British blockade. A 74-gun ship was the backbone of any major fleet, carrying roughly twice the firepower and significantly more men than Pellew's frigate. 1 Convention dictated that a frigate should flee from a ship of the line, or at best, keep it under distant observation. To engage was sheer lunacy. But the Duguay-Trouin was heavily laden and in poor repair, having sustained damage. She was seeking refuge, not battle. Pellew, however, recognized a unique opportunity and immediately launched a relentless pursuit. He drove the Indefatigable forward, using his frigate's superior speed to stay just beyond the effective range of the French ship's main batteries, while simultaneously harassing the slower warship. The key to Pellew's maneuver was psychological. He refused to give the French captain, Claude Touffet, a moment's peace. The Duguay-Trouin was a capital ship, yet she was being stalked and harried by a single frigate, like a massive, wounded beast being chased by a relentless, aggressive predator. Pellew's reputation, the man who would board anything, the captain whose crews were drilled to kill, preceded him. The pursuit became a masterclass in aggressive seamanship. Over the course of a harrowing chase, Pellew maneuvered his ship to consistently annoy, intimidate, and occasionally take a pot-shot at the French Leviathan, preventing Touffet from regaining his composure or finding a clear escape route. The climax arrived when Pellew's persistence paid off. The French ship, exhausted and increasingly demoralized by the endless harassment and the knowledge that Pellew was determined to destroy them, was finally cornered and, crucially, sighted by the rest of the approaching British squadron. Facing the inevitable combined force, and his ship leaking and struggling, Captain Touffet had no choice but to surrender. The capture was strategic gold. The Duguay-Trouin was taken into the Royal Navy and renamed HMS Implacable, becoming one of the most effective British ships of the line for decades. This victory proved that Pellew's influence extended far beyond his immediate command. His fame, his demonstrated willingness to engage against impossible odds, created a psychological weapon that often cowed his opponents into submission before a single shot was fired. It was a victory won by audacious pressure, confirming that Edward Pellew was not just a master tactician, but a commander who understood the power of reputation. After his relentless service in the Channel, culminating in the capture of the Duguay-Trouin, Edward Pellew was elevated to flag rank and given an appointment of colossal strategic importance, Commander-in-Chief of the East Indies Station. This transition from the white-hot, singular actions of the frigate war to the vast, complex, and slow-moving theater of the East was a true test of his administrative and strategic genius. This phase, while less celebrated than his dramatic frigate duels, was arguably more critical to the long-term security of the British Empire. The East Indies, encompassing the immense span of the Indian Ocean, the Malacca Straits, and the Dutch East Indies, modern Indonesia, was a vital, yet precarious, British interest. It was the linchpin of global trade, centered on the Indian Raj and the priceless commodities of tea, spices, and silk. 1 The enemy here was not just the French, but the Dutch, who, having been subjugated by Napoleon and renamed the Batavian Republic, commanded a large and geographically dispersed colonial empire that threatened the British dominance in the region. Pellew arrived in 1805 and immediately faced a logistical nightmare. The station was plagued by disease, enormous distances, and a lack of effective communication. The objective was clear: eradicate all enemy naval and colonial presence to ensure the security of India. This was not a war of single heroic actions, but of methodical, strategic attrition, a masterclass in power projection. He quickly stamped his trademark efficiency and discipline on the command. He drove his captains mercilessly, demanding the same speed and readiness from the entire squadron that he had enforced on his own frigates. He understood that in a region of vast emptiness, speed of intelligence and concentration of force were paramount. Pellew's strategy focused on a series of decisive, yet low-key, operations designed to systematically dismantle the Dutch and French infrastructure. His forces conducted a series of amphibious attacks and blockades that targeted key Dutch strongholds and commerce raiding bases. The major operations focused on securing the Dutch possessions, which served as crucial stepping stones for French privateers. The capture of Spice Islands. He organized and supported expeditions that systematically took control of the lucrative Spice Islands, the Moluccas, starving the French of resources and eliminating privateering bases. the seizure of Java. Though the full seizure of Java would come slightly later, Pellew laid the essential groundwork, establishing the strategic control necessary to later conquer this massive and important Dutch holding. This campaign of methodical conquest was a strategic masterstroke. By 1811, under Pellew's oversight and planning, though he had retired from the command by the time of the final Java campaign, British forces had effectively neutralized the entire French and Dutch presence in the east. He secured the Indian Ocean, eliminating the threat to British commerce and consolidating a territorial position that would remain the cornerstone of the empire for the next century. In the East Indies, Pellew proved himself to be more than just a fighting captain. He was an unbeatable admiral, a strategic architect capable of managing a theater of war half a world away, securing British economic dominance through careful planning, relentless pressure, and a refusal to tolerate the inefficiencies and delays that had plagued previous commands. He traded the drama of the cannon shot for the quiet, enduring power of total strategic victory, setting the ultimate stage for the grandest climax of his career. Following his strategic triumph in the East Indies, Edward Pellew, now Admiral Lord Exmouth, was recalled to Europe, where he was tasked with a final, monumental challenge that would serve as the ultimate display of his courage and tactical resolve. This mission was not about colonial power or revolutionary war. It was a moral imperative against a centuries-old evil, the Barbary slave trade. For generations, the regencies of North Africa, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli had sustained themselves through state-sanctioned piracy. Their corsairs preyed upon Christian shipping in the Mediterranean, seizing cargoes and, more notoriously, enslaving the crews and passengers. By the early 19th century, this practice had become an intolerable affront to the emerging humanitarian sensibilities of Europe. It was a vestige of medieval brutality that had to be definitively crushed. Pellew was first sent to negotiate, and while he secured the release of some slaves, the inherent duplicity and greed of the Dey of Algiers, the powerful ruler, made it clear that diplomacy alone was futile. The ultimate act of defiance came on the very day Pellew left. A massacre of hundreds of Corsican and Neapolitan fishermen at Beaune, a blatant signal that the Dey would not bow to European pressure. The British government, finally galvanized by public outrage, gave Pellew the authority he truly needed, to return, not as an envoy, but as an agent of vengeance, and to end the piracy once and for all through overwhelming force. The objective was simple, yet seemingly impossible: destroy the fortifications of Algiers and secure the freedom of every Christian slave. The defenses of Algiers were legendary. The city was built in a tiered amphitheater, rising from the sea and dominated by a fortress. Its harbor was protected by massive, thick stone batteries and ramparts bristling with hundreds of heavy guns. These fortifications, built over centuries, were designed to withstand exactly the kind of naval assault Pellew was planning. To anchor a fleet within range of these massive shore defenses was considered a suicidal mission for a fixed-position attack. Land batteries, positioned high up and firing down, held a devastating tactical advantage over ships firing upwards from the rolling sea. Pellew, undaunted, assembled an Anglo-Dutch combined fleet. His flagship was the mighty HMS Queen Charlotte, a 100-gun first-rate ship of the line. The planning that went into this operation was meticulous and reflected Pellew's ultimate tactical genius. He realized that the key to victory lay not in distant, slow-motion bombardment, but in a final, audacious commitment to the close-range, overwhelming violence he had first perfected with the Nymph. His plan was revolutionary. The fleet would not bombard from a safe distance. Instead, Pellew intended to anchor his most powerful ships within point-blank range of the main harbor batteries. This was an act of extreme audacity, designed to negate the advantage of the massive fortifications by striking them where they were weakest, at their very foundations, where the shot would not simply glance off the thick walls. As the fleet sailed into the bay on August 27, 1816, the Dey's forces watched from the massive walls, brimming with confidence. The sight of a foreign fleet sailing directly into the mouth of their fortress was met not with fear, but with arrogance. They believed their walls were impregnable, their guns superior, and the British admiral was making a fatal, arrogant mistake. Pellew was about to prove them devastatingly wrong. He was preparing to engage in the most intense naval bombardment against fixed defenses ever recorded up to that time, staking his reputation and the lives of his 6,000 men on one final, terrifying gamble. The day of August 27, 1816, began with an uneasy calm, a final, tense pause before the eruption of industrial warfare against an immovable fortress. As the combined Anglo-Dutch fleet, under the command of Admiral Lord Exmouth, Edward Pellew, sailed into the Bay of Algiers, the Algerian batteries remained silent, watching the audacious approach. Pellew, standing on the deck of his flagship, HMS Queen Charlotte, was about to execute the most dangerous maneuver of his career, a gamble that defied naval convention. Pellew's tactical brilliance lay in his understanding of geometry and psychological warfare. He knew that the high, thick stone ramparts were nearly impervious to conventional, arcing cannon fire from a distance. The only way to breach them was through horizontal, sustained, point-blank fire. This required anchoring the great capital ships so close to the batteries that their shot would strike the stone walls at the waterline, where they were thickest but most vulnerable to being undercut. The Queen Charlotte, a 100-gun first-rate ship of the line, was deliberately sailed to a position of maximum peril and maximum effect. Pellew steered her to within 50 yards of the Molehead Battery, the massive structure that protected the harbor entrance and mounted the heaviest guns. This was a position of utter audacity, almost within pistol-shot range, directly challenging the heart of the Algerian defenses. As the Queen Charlotte dropped her anchor, her mighty broadside was perfectly positioned to rake the enemy positions. Pellew refused to fire first, granting the day a final, chilling moment to capitulate. He sent a boat with a last ultimatum, but as it returned, the Algerian guns, finally losing patience, opened fire. The ensuing battle was a spectacle of unparalleled ferocity. Pellew's fleet was anchored in a perfect crescent, with the Queen Charlotte leading the line, absorbing the initial shock. The moment the Algerian guns fired, Pellew's fleet unleashed a coordinated, earth-shaking response. The sheer volume and concentration of British fire, delivered at such a close range, was overwhelming. The battle instantly became an artillery duel of staggering intensity. The Algerians fought with immense courage, their high-mounted guns raining down shot onto the decks of the Allied ships. The British sustained heavy casualties and devastating damage to their masts and rigging. At one point, the Queen Charlotte was taking fire from two sides, suffering concentrated attacks that ripped through her structure. But the Algerians had underestimated the rate of fire and discipline of the British crews. Just as Pellew had taught his pressed men on the Nymph, the Queen Charlotte's gunners maintained a fearsome, disciplined pace. The relentless British broadsides, 4 tons of iron shot every 5 minutes, hammered the mole. The shot, striking horizontally, did not just chip the stone, it gouged out massive chunks, destabilizing the foundations of the batteries. The climax was reached when the British bomb vessels and rocket boats, positioned in support, began their work. Their explosive ordnance, coupled with the precision of the naval guns, set fire to the Algerian fleet huddled within the harbor. The flames spread rapidly, consuming the day's entire naval force. The sight of their own ships burning, casting a terrifying golden glow onto the ramparts, was a monumental psychological blow to the defenders. Pellew, utterly exposed and fighting amidst the chaos, remained the iron core of the engagement. His personal presence, a man who had rescued hundreds from a wreck and fought frigates at point-blank range, ensured his exhausted men fought on. He directed the fire with meticulous precision, focusing on silencing the main batteries and ensuring the relentless damage to the harbor wall continued. By late afternoon, the combined fire had achieved the impossible. The main batteries were silenced, the walls were collapsing, and the entire Algerian fleet was a funeral pyre. The unprecedented maneuver of sustained, close-range engagement had utterly destroyed the fortifications, shattering the enemy's confidence and military capacity. The city was defenseless. Pellew had risked everything, anchored his ship in hell, and secured the most absolute victory against fixed coastal defenses in the history of sail. The Barbary threat was broken. The phase of the bombardment of Algiers between 3 p.m. and 7 p.m. on August 27, 1816, was not merely an exchange of fire, it was a furious, concentrated artillery duel that transformed the calm bay into a literal vision of hell. This chapter focuses entirely on the sheer intensity, the numerical disparity, and the terrifying close-range mechanics that defined this climactic confrontation. The sheer, brute force unleashed by both sides was unprecedented in naval history for a fixed-position attack. The Allied fleet, predominantly British with a supporting Dutch squadron, fielded approximately 1,000 guns, but they were attacking a fortress mounting well over 220 heavy cannon and mortars along the mole and the upper citadel. The numerical disparity was clear, but the geometrical disparity was crippling. The ships were below, vulnerable, while the forts fired down, protected by massive stone. Admiral Pellew's gamble was now fully in play, and the cost was immediate and horrifying. Anchoring the HMS Queen Charlotte within 50 yards of the main mole battery meant that every single shot fired by the enemy at that position had a devastating effect. The Algerian gunners, fighting for their city and freedom, were relentless. Their heavy shot ripped through the thin wooden structures of the ships with ease. The decks of the British ships became slaughterhouses. The Queen Charlotte alone was raked by fire from multiple directions, including the high, flanking batteries. Massive splinters, naval shrapnel, flew in every direction. Rigging, masts, and spars were shot away, transforming the proud ships into mangled, smoking hulks. Casualties mounted at an alarming rate. Men were killed at their stations, yet the living continued to load and fire with a discipline that spoke volumes of Pellew's training. The Algerian confidence, however, was being systematically shattered by the British rate of fire. The unique power of the Allied fleet lay in its ability to deliver an overwhelming volume of concentrated fire from multiple ships into a single, localized target. Pellew's orders ensured the broadsides were not aimed at the high battlements, but low, at the base of the massive stone walls. The cumulative effect was like a giant battering ram. The stone ramparts began to crumble from the bottom up. The atmosphere was unbearable. The noise was a continuous, brain-rattling thunder. The smoke was so thick that the gunners couldn't see the targets just 50 yards away, often requiring crews to fire by counting the enemy's muzzle flashes. The heat from the continuous discharge of the guns was scorching, and the threat of ship fires from enemy hotshot was constant. It was, quite literally, hell on the water. This was the moment of unprecedented maneuver, a duel fought not for hours, but for minutes at a time, where survival depended entirely on the speed of the British reload. The British crew's superior training, the hallmark of Pellew's career, became the decisive factor. They could fire 2 broadsides for every one the slower, less drilled Algerian gunners could manage. This meant that while the Algerians were reloading, the British could inflict damage, suppress the enemy fire, and maintain the terrifying pressure. The ultimate breakthrough occurred when the fire from the bomb vessels took effect. Their high-trajectory shells, coupled with the focused naval fire, ignited the ships in the inner harbor and started major fires on shore. This blinding conflagration, illuminating the bay in an apocalyptic orange and red glow, further disoriented the Algerian defenders. The British fleet sustained over 800 casualties, a horrific toll that underscored the danger of the position. But by nightfall, the relentless intensity and superior rate of fire had completely silenced the molehead and the harbor defenses. The tactical gamble had paid off. Pellew had used concentrated, close-range violence to negate the superiority of fixed defenses, ensuring that the impossible resistance of the Algerians was crushed in a single, terrifying afternoon of fire and iron. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon on August 27, 1816, the maelstrom of the artillery duel began to subside, revealing a scene of utter, apocalyptic destruction. The noise died, the smoke gradually cleared, and the exhausted British and Dutch crews could survey the terrible consequence of their commitment. This was the moment of complete strategic collapse, the shattering point for the ancient power of the day of Algiers. The first clear sign of victory was the condition of the fortress itself. The massive, centuries-old stone ramparts that had made Algiers impregnable were no more. Pellew's concentrated, close-range fire had systematically disemboweled the defenses. The main batteries protecting the mole were silenced, their stone breastworks reduced to rubble and their heavy guns dismounted or buried under debris. The day's confidence, founded entirely on the perceived strength of these walls, had been physically demolished. But the most compelling proof of victory lay within the harbor. The glow from the receding fires confirmed the scale of the devastation. Every single one of the Algerian naval vessels, frigates, corvettes, and gunboats, had been ignited and destroyed. The day's entire naval force, the instrument of the Barbary piracy, was a smoldering ruin. The infrastructure of the slave trade was irrevocably broken. The harbor entrance was choked with wreckage and the ghostly remnants of the fleet. Pellew, though his own ship, the Queen Charlotte, was severely damaged with over 128 shots through her hull and masts reduced to splinters, had won the most decisive victory against coastal fortifications in the age of sail. He had gambled on the discipline of his crews and the audacity of his maneuver, and they had delivered. The cost was high. The Allied fleet suffered over 880 killed and wounded, but the military objective was achieved with terrifying totality. During the night, as the British ships struggled to anchor and repair their crippling damage, Pellew sent a final, blunt message to the defiant day. The terms were simple and non-negotiable: immediate and unconditional surrender of all Christian slaves, repayment of the ransoms already extorted, and a public declaration ending the practice of slavery and piracy forever. The message was backed by a single, powerful threat: if the Dey refused, the bombardment would resume at dawn, and this time, the city itself would be reduced to dust. The Dey, Hajj Ali, surveyed the wreckage of his city. His defenses were gone, his fleet was incinerated, and his military capacity was zero. The will to resist had been completely crushed by the terror of Pellew's assault. The legendary, seemingly invincible Fortress of Algiers was brought to its knees by the sheer, sustained violence of a British admiral who refused to quit. The very next morning, the Dey capitulated. It was an unconditional surrender. The immediate, dramatic consequence was the release of over 1,200 Christian slaves of various European nationalities. The sight of these terrified, emaciated captives walking free from their dungeons under the protection of the very man who had commanded the destructive assault was a profound, emotional climax to the mission. Gold and ransoms were restored, treaties were signed under duress, and the practice of Christian slavery in Algiers, which had endured for centuries, was effectively and violently ended. The bombardment of Algiers was not just a naval victory, it was a defining geopolitical moment. It established a new precedent for British power projection and moral authority, demonstrating to the world that there were limits to acceptable barbarism and that the Royal Navy was prepared to enforce those limits with overwhelming force. Pellew had risked total annihilation to achieve a complete moral and military triumph, securing a legacy of courage that spanned the brutal hand-to-hand fight of the Nymph to the inferno of Algiers. In the aftermath of the sheer, earth-shattering victory at Algiers, one might expect Edward Pellew, now Viscount Exmouth, to have been instantly crowned with laurels and celebrated as the savior of Mediterranean peace. Instead, the final act of his career was marred by bureaucratic friction, political controversy, and a painful lack of the overwhelming, unanimous recognition enjoyed by his predecessor, Nelson. This demonstrated the inherent ingratitude of a naval establishment that often struggled to fully appreciate merit that deviated from its rigid internal politics. The first sign of official displeasure came not from a failure in action, but from the immense damage sustained by the Allied fleet. While Pellew had achieved his strategic goal, the total military and moral defeat of the day, the sheer intensity of the close-range fighting had battered his capital ships almost beyond recognition. The Admiralty, focused less on the humanitarian triumph and more on the cost of repair, questioned the wisdom of Pellew's suicidal anchoring position. There were whispers and official inquiries, the naval equivalent of a post-action court-martial, suggesting that the admiral had exposed the ships to unnecessary peril, risking the very vessels that formed the core of the British line. The argument boiled down to a fundamental conflict in naval philosophy. Was it better to achieve a limited, safe victory, or an absolute, decisive one at the highest possible cost? Pellew, a man who always sought the latter, found himself defending his methods against officers who had never endured the close-range hell he commanded. Furthermore, the post-war naval establishment was steeped in patronage. Nelson had been the beneficiary of massive public adoration and political favor. Pellew, the man without privilege, found his accolades to be more measured. He was raised to the peerage and given honors, but the sheer narrative power of Trafalgar, a victory that ended the main naval war with a decisive, romantic death, overshadowed the morally complicated, costly victory at Algiers. The public, weary from decades of war, quickly forgot the details of the Barbary threat, focusing instead on the final, glorious image of Nelson. The controversy was exacerbated by the distribution of prize money and rewards. The process was complex and fraught with internal rivalries. There were complaints from some of the Dutch and even some of the British captains that the sharing of the spoils, and the official dispatches detailing individual gallantry, were unfair. These disputes, though petty, were enough to cloud the narrative of a clean, heroic triumph. Pellew, a man of fierce integrity, was deeply wounded by the implied criticism. He saw his actions, rescuing hundreds from the Dutton, destroying the French presence in the East Indies, and now ending centuries of slavery, as service beyond compare. Yet, the bureaucracy of the Admiralty often preferred safe conformity to audacious genius. In the end, while no formal court-martial proceeded against him for Algiers, the need for him to defend the cost of his victory rather than simply celebrate the freedom of the slaves speaks to the ingratitude and political complexity of the age. He had done the impossible and broken a terrible institution, only to be questioned on the financial prudence of the victory. Edward Pellew was a hero of iron will and brilliant merit, but in the theatre of public memory and political recognition, he was always relegated to the shadow of the great, untouchable colossus of Trafalgar. The career of Edward Pellew, Viscount Exmouth, was not defined by a single, shattering blow like Trafalgar, but by a series of meticulous, geographically disparate actions that collectively cemented British global supremacy for the century that followed. His victories were less about romantic glory and more about the cold, hard reality of global power projection. Pellew's strategic consequence can be divided into two critical theaters, each with profound long-term global impact. Securing the East Indies and the Indian Empire. Pellew's time as Commander-in-Chief in the East Indies, 1805 to 1811, was one of the most strategically significant, yet least celebrated, periods of his career. At stake was nothing less than the Indian Raj and the immense economic power derived from controlling Asian trade routes. When Pellew arrived, the French and their Dutch allies posed a severe, existential threat to the British East India Company's dominance. The Dutch East Indies, Indonesia, offered strategic bases and refuge for French privateers, allowing them to bleed British commerce dry. Pellew's achievement was not a grand fleet action, but a comprehensive campaign of strategic eradication. He systematically planned and directed expeditions that targeted and captured key enemy strongholds, including the highly lucrative Spice Islands. His disciplined pressure ensured that when the final campaigns against the massive island of Java were launched, the necessary infrastructure and logistical superiority were firmly in British hands. By neutralizing the French and Batavian, Dutch, naval and colonial presence, Pellew single-handedly secured the eastern flank of the British Empire. This ensured the uninterrupted flow of wealth from India to London, financing the wars against Napoleon and underwriting Britain's rise as the world's preeminent economic power. Without Pellew's meticulous, unrelenting work in the East, the foundation of the 19th-century British Empire would have been severely weakened, if not dismantled. Ending the Barbary threat and establishing moral authority. The bombardment of Algiers in 1816, while costly, had a staggering global impact that transcended the military sphere and established a new level of British moral authority in the post-Napoleonic world. The action secured the immediate release of over 1,200 European slaves, instantly marking a humanitarian victory that resonated across the continent. More importantly, it achieved what centuries of diplomacy and sporadic punitive actions had failed to do. It ended state-sanctioned Barbary piracy. The destruction of the Algerian fleet and fortifications crippled the naval capacity of the regencies. While minor acts of piracy continued, the large-scale, systematic enslavement of Christians ceased to be a major threat. This singular victory redefined the rules of international engagement. It demonstrated that Britain was prepared to use its overwhelming naval power not just for conquest, but for what it deemed a moral cause. The action set a precedent for intervention that would be cited for decades. It solidified Britain's position as the policeman of the seas, a role crucial to maintaining the stability necessary for global trade and the Pax Britannica that followed the Congress of Vienna. In both the East and the Mediterranean, Pellew's actions ensured that the economic engine of the empire, Indian trade, was protected and the strategic choke points, the Straits and the Barbary Coast, were cleared of systemic threats. Edward Pellew was not merely a brilliant captain. He was an architect of empire, whose genius for achieving absolute victory against long odds laid the strategic groundwork for the globalized world of the 19th century. Despite his monumental achievements, saving hundreds of lives, defeating 2 major fleets, securing the East Indies, and ending the Barbary slave trade, Edward Pellew remains largely absent from the popular historical consciousness. The simple, yet profound, truth is that he was overshadowed by the Colossus, Horatio Nelson. This chapter explores why Nelson, the hero of Trafalgar, captured the historical narrative, relegating Pellew, the equally brilliant and more consistently successful tactician, to the shadows. The divergence in historical memory is rooted not in military genius, but in narrative and persona. The nature of the final victory. Nelson's defining moment, the Battle of Trafalgar, 1805, was the perfect historical climax. It was a single, massive, definitive fleet action that permanently shattered the combined French and Spanish naval power, ensuring Britain's naval supremacy for a century. Crucially, Nelson's victory was sealed by his heroic, sacrificial death. Dying at the moment of his greatest triumph instantly elevated him to the status of a martyred demigod. His famous last signal, "England expects that every man will do his duty," provided a perfect, quotable motto for posterity. Pellew's greatest climax, the bombardment of Algiers, 1816, was politically complex and materially costly. It was a punitive action against a non-European power after the Napoleonic Wars had ended. It lacked the immediate, existential threat that defined Trafalgar. Furthermore, Pellew survived. He lived to argue with the Admiralty, to handle political controversies, and to endure the inevitable decline of old age. He provided no single, definitive, tragic image to imprint itself on the public mind. The persona romance versus reality. Nelson was a master of self-promotion and possessed a captivating, romantic persona. His scandalous affair with Lady Hamilton, his missing arm and eye, and his disregard for conventional military protocol gave him a fiery, flawed, and therefore deeply human and relatable image. He was the perfect dramatic hero. Pellew, in contrast, was the embodiment of the meritocratic work ethic. He was fierce, meticulous, and focused on operational efficiency. His bravery was often expressed through personal, selfless acts, like the Dutton rescue, rather than grand, theatrical gestures. He lacked the high society connections that fueled Nelson's fame and possessed a reputation for an abrasive, uncompromising focus on duty. He was the efficient, reliable architect of victory, whereas Nelson was the flamboyant, charismatic star. The public, naturally, preferred the drama of the star to the consistency of the architect. The problem of proximity. Pellew and Nelson often operated in the same timeframe, but Pellew was consistently overshadowed by Nelson's celebrity. When Pellew captured the Cleopatra in a stunning duel, Nelson was already a celebrated admiral. When Pellew was securing the East Indies, Nelson was preparing for the final, history-defining confrontation at Trafalgar. History rarely has room for two such dominant heroes at once, and Nelson's dramatic rise and fall consumed all the available oxygen in the naval narrative. In the end, Nelson's legacy was secured by the clean, conclusive nature of his great victory and his dramatic, myth-making death. Pellew's legacy, conversely, is defined by the messy, demanding reality of continuous, vital service, a series of hard-won, but politically complex, strategic victories. He was the indispensable workhorse that built and maintained the empire, but the nation chose to remember the thoroughbred who won the final, decisive race. Pellew was the embodiment of the forgotten genius, a hero whose success was too effective, too widely dispersed, and too practically grounded to ever achieve the tragic romance of a historical legend. The history books may dedicate the grandest pages to the charismatic hero who fell at the moment of triumph, but the professional navy, the actual fighting force, owes an eternal debt to the quiet, enduring genius of Edward Pellew. His legacy is not a statue of tragic martyrdom, but a set of practical, brutal, and utterly successful military doctrines that changed war forever, a hidden victory that persisted long after his name faded from common remembrance. Pellew's most significant contribution was the permanent shift he forced upon Royal Navy tactics. Before him, the Navy, for all its power, was often bound by an overabundance of caution, particularly in single-ship actions and against fixed defenses. After Pellew's career, the core philosophy of the British fighting sailor began to change. The doctrine of audacity and speed. Pellew proved, repeatedly, that absolute, overwhelming aggression was the most effective means of overcoming tactical disparity. His doctrine was founded on three non-negotiable principles. Concentrated, close-range fire. He demonstrated that the psychological and material damage inflicted by a broadside fired at point-blank range was exponentially greater than one fired at distance. This principle of driving relentlessly into the enemy's teeth became a key element of the aggressive, risk-taking attitude that defined future British commanders. Superior training and rate of fire. Pellew showed that rigorous, almost fanatical, training in gunnery and sail handling was the true source of victory, not social status. His crews were simply faster and more precise. This emphasis on meritocratic excellence over aristocratic lineage solidified the professionalism of the Royal Navy. The annihilation of will, his ultimate objective was never merely to win, but to shatter the enemy's will to resist. From the instantaneous boarding of the Cleopatra to the punishing, close-in duel at Algiers, Pellew's tactics were designed to induce shock and demoralization, forcing surrender before the battle reached its full, costly conclusion. The architect of modern power projection. Beyond tactics, Pellew's career established a new standard for British power projection. His work in the East Indies, though unsung, was the administrative and strategic blueprint for securing a vast, complex colonial theatre. He proved that naval power could be used not just for battle, but for strategic endurance, maintaining vital trade routes and systematically dismantling rival colonial empires over vast distances. The bombardment of Algiers stands as the ultimate testament to his forgotten genius. It was the first instance where a great naval power committed to a major, costly operation for purely moral and humanitarian ends. While the political aftermath was messy, the strategic impact was permanent. Pellew demonstrated that the era of state-sponsored Barbary piracy was over, effectively enforcing a new international standard of conduct in the Mediterranean. 1. Edward Pellew was, in essence, the indispensable engineer of the Pax Britannica. He was the necessary bridge between the formalized, 18th-century navy and the aggressive, ruthlessly efficient force that dominated the world in the 19th century. He was the man who never sought the spotlight, preferring the hard-won reality of a successful mission to the fleeting praise of the crowd. The final irony is this: Edward Pellew was the embodiment of the forgotten genius. He was a hero who faced down impossible odds not for fame, but because his personal code of courage and competence demanded it. While Nelson's legacy is preserved in marble and myth, Pellew's true memorial exists in the fighting spirit and professional standards of every disciplined sailor who ever sailed under the white ensign, a standard he created, a legacy that endures.